his house in Rillier, that Cthulhu waits dreaming. The words pounded in Henry's mind as he clawed his way to the shore. The sky was, fittingly, green, as the young man coughed salt water until he vomited on the stone path and looked up to the island, before dropping to his knees and vomiting again. This time, it wasn't from the salt water. He couldn't remember boarding a ship, didn't remember wrecking. He had no idea what he was doing here. He was a sculptor, an artist, not a sailor. And this place made his mind hurt. Rock clung to the ancient stone buildings, if they could even be called that. The buildings, they didn't make sense. Stairways contorted and connected back onto themselves. You could climb a walkway in a tower to its own base. The whole place was constantly warping and changing, yet remained still as a corpse. As Henry staggered further inland, words pounded in his head, a mantra in the background of his mind in some dark, forgotten, obscene language that, somehow, he understood. In his house in Rillier, that Cthulhu waits dreaming. There, in the center of the island, stood a tower, a cathedral, and even though he couldn't recall how he managed to arrive there, Henry felt overwhelmingly drawn to that single tower, that monolith. Going there was the solution to everything. He sensed his mind beginning to slip away. Within moments, he could barely remember his own name. Really, he hardly had any other thoughts at all, save those repeating words. Pain pulsed throughout his body, and though his eyes burned, staring at the warping, greenish-black city that rose from the shadows, a beautiful despair washed over him in waves as he thought upon those never-ending words. He began clinging to them, embracing them. The young man scanned the sky, the sunlight already darkening. He knew who would be in this place. And he was right. Except that that looming who wasn't just in the sky. It was the sky. The darkness seemed to cling to it so tightly that, initially, Henry mistook it for a storm cloud. The tallest spires of the surrounding ancient architecture, already dozens of stories tall, barely reached the thing's shrouded knees. Henry had to turn his head to take in the immensity of the thing's wings. That was when he saw the eyes. The monster, the Colossus, emerged from the mist, tentacles dangling and writhing from its head, eyes staring into him, dark and cold, like black pearls. In an instant, the thing's hatred, the thing's hunger hit Henry, and it was then that Henry broke. There are things that no human is equipped to handle. Nothing on earth should be, or could be, that big. Looking into the eyes of that thing, thousands of feet tall and staring down at him, was downright horrifying. And, for an instant, it washed the words from Henry's mind. For that instant, he was free. It was his own scream that woke him up. Henry was in total darkness, drenched in his own sweat, and shivering in the cold New Hampshire air. This didn't make any sense. What was he doing here? Was he just on an island? After a few moments, Henry slowly began to accept that this was reality. He was at home. So, apparently, that had only been a dream. That's when he noticed he wasn't actually in bed. He wasn't even laying down. Instead, he was in his studio. Clay smeared all over his hands. He had clearly gotten out of bed in the middle of the night and was working on something based on the mass of clay before him on the bench. Henry stood and found the electric light out of habit. After many late nights, he could find it by muscle memory alone. He flipped the switch and screamed again, startled as he registered his latest project. Henry recoiled and trembled. This time, it wasn't from the cold. It was from what he had been shaping, what he had been making as his hands worked involuntarily. Already drying in the cold air sat a clay relief, an image carved in clay. It was of the thing from the island, that winged monster with the face of an octopus. Its small clay eyes seared through him, just like the monster from his dream, trespassing into the back of his mind. Somewhere, just beyond thought, a sentence in an ancient and terrifying language beat like a drum. In his house in Rillier, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. I'm Jason Weiser. From Bardic, this is Fictional. Second mate Johansson crawled to his captain, staying low to avoid the gunfire. He could hear the captain sucking air through his wound. He couldn't move, and Johansson reached him just as he stopped breathing, the last look of terror frozen on his face, forever. They had been blown off course, pushed far, far out into the ocean a few hours after the earthquake. It was so strong that they had felt it at sea. Their luck hadn't improved, as the storms only grew worse. After a week, they were in deep ocean, weeks away from where they were supposed to be, and with dwindling supplies. Then, off in the distance, they saw the Alert. The ship, named the Alert, looked ragged, even from leagues away. The paint was peeling, the sides overrun with rust in several spots. Its seaworthiness was a miracle in itself, let alone that it had made it so far from land. The captain of the Emma, Johansson's ship, signaled to the Alert to see if they were in need of assistance. The crewmen responded. Emma had their first and final warning. Turn back. Now. The captain took another look at the ship and shook his head. He put down the radio and ordered the Emma forward. It was the last order he would ever give. Seconds later, he caught a bullet in the neck. The Alert was firing on them. Diving below the gunfire, second mate Johansson crawled on his elbows over to where he'd seen his captain fall. Johansson was with the captain in his final moments, and then saw a shadow fall over him. First mate Collins stood in shock after watching his captain be shot right next to him. Johansson yelled for him to get down, but it was too late. Johansson's blonde hair turned red with the spray of blood and brain as the opposing gunman from the Alert found another target. That's when the ship lurched with a thud. There was yelling and more gunfire as Johansson dared to glance over the railing. They were being boarded. Johansson looked back at his captain and dead first mate. Johansson was the second mate. Well, he had been the second mate, he corrected himself. Now, he was the captain of the Emma, and he was going to take back his ship. Professor Angel heard the ring at the door and slowly rose to his feet. The 92-year-old's bones ached in the cold, but he was still young enough to answer the door on his own, if slowly. Whoever it was couldn't wait for the professor and began to grow increasingly frantic, pressing the button over and over and over again. Angel's annoyance grew with every step until he made it to the door and flung it wide open with a loud and curt, "What?" The "what" happened to be a strung-out young man with deeply ringed eyes, shivering in the frigid air. He introduced himself as Henry. "I think you have the wrong house," Angel said, and started to close the door, but the young man caught it firmly, mid-swing. "Dr. Angel, professor of ancient Semitic languages at Brown, right?" Henry greeted. "Yes," the old man replied, fearing that the man actually did have the correct address. "No, you're the one I'm looking for. I think I might have something of interest to you," Henry insisted, and held out a small relief that he had carved the night before. The professor rolled his eyes at the trinket. That is, before he saw the markings at the bottom. He snatched the thing from the man and studied it closely from all sides. "What language is this?" the professor asked, pulling his glasses from his coat. "I mean, that is the one reason I would come to the local expert in ancient languages. Sir, Professor, I have no idea," Henry said, "but I do know how to say it." At this point, Henry repeated words that the story calls an unpronounceable jumble of letters, so I'm not even gonna try. But some random artist off the street knowing clearly how to pronounce ancient words that a professor of ancient languages didn't even recognize was different, to say the least. He motioned for the young man to come inside. Inside, after they sat down for some coffee, Professor Angel started talking. "So, that whole dream thing, it was a lie, right? I mean, it's okay. I don't judge you. But this," the professor said, holding up the image, This is something. Look, the professor continued, I'm cool. Like I said, I don't judge, but, what exactly are the details of your cult? Or at least let me know the language I should start on. I'm not in a cult, Henry said. My apologies, Professor corrected. That's my fault. I meant follower of the one true something. Why are you winking at me? Stop winking, Henry said, taking a step backward. I'm not a cultist. Is that even a thing? You have no idea, said the professor. So tell me, where did you get this image and these words? If not from your cult buddies. Henry reiterated that he himself had made it while unconscious, and further explained his dream about the terrifying city of sky-flung monoliths, of the buildings that had hurt his mind, and of the thing. After nearly an hour in conversation, Joe was mostly convinced that Henry wasn't part of a cult, but still, he had to know more. He invited the young man to swing by again, if he had any more dreams. And, as the young man would return day in and day out for the next few weeks, he had no idea what he had started. The man crawled toward Johansen, knife in his bloody hand. The stranger from the attacking ship was so wounded that he wasn't going to live, but Johansen could see that he wasn't going to give up either. None of them had. Johansen cocked his pistol and fired. When the shot rang out, the attack on the Emma was finished. Johansen and his men had won, despite the strangers from the Alert getting the jump on them. The sailors on the Emma had quickly recovered. Some grabbed guns, some wrenches and crowbars, and some even grappled the attackers as they jumped aboard the ship. In the end, everyone, all 8 people from the Alert, the attacking ship, were dead. The Emma had suffered but 2 casualties, the captain and the first mate. Johansen and his remaining men investigated the Alert. It seemed to be more rust than boat. A sailor for nearly 2 decades, Johansen had no idea how it had made it so far. Then, he got an idea. Perhaps it hadn't come so far. He pulled out a map, but didn't see any nearby islands for hundreds of leagues. He gathered his crew and shared his thoughts. They agreed. There was no way this ship could make it that far, in this shape, with no provisions. This thing was almost monastically bare. The only item they found aboard was a strange green statuette of a winged green monster with tentacles on its face. As a crew, they agreed to press on, to see why the Alert had given them the fateful order to turn back, to see what they were hiding. And, as they looked back and saw the Emma sinking from the damage it had taken in the attack, they saw that they were now the proud owners of the Alert. So they pressed on. It was less than a day when, in the mists, they saw the dark spires rising from the ocean, twisted citadel in the middle, with a monolith atop it. It wasn't on any map, but they had found an island. Henry swung by the professor's home nearly every morning, and, over the next few weeks, the professor noted the bags under the young man's eyes, growing deeper and darker. His skin was becoming increasingly pale. In the moments when the professor wasn't in the room, and Henry thought the old man couldn't hear him, Henry would perseverate, uttering those same strange words over and over. In his house in Rillier, de Cthulhu waits dreaming. Naturally, the professor was intrigued and spent every spare moment between visits trying to figure out this strange language. It became his singular mission. He sent letters far and wide to colleagues around the world, wondering if they had heard this unfamiliar language or seen the creature that Henry had sculpted. He asked for news, and he got news. First, it came as a trickle, then a torrent. A man in the UK had shrieked those words before diving out his window. During one of Henry's worst nights, when his own visions were the most intense, a police officer in New York City said he heard those words before being overwhelmed by a mob and being beaten so badly that he had to go to the hospital. People in white robes in California began to speak the same incomprehensible language and talk about a glorious fulfillment. Mobs and violence broke out all over the world over those few nights, all connected with that same name, Cthulhu. Word began to arrive so quickly, Angel stopped scribbling down individual names and cases. but kept a running tally instead. That was when something really chilling arrived. It was less a letter and more of a novel. It was from a colleague down south, in Louisiana, and described an event nearly 15 years prior, where they had discovered a statue similar to the image Henry depicted. Except this one had been covered in blood. We'll learn what happened deep in the swamps of Louisiana, but that will be right after this. HelloFresh is a meal kit delivery service that shops, plans, and delivers step-by-step recipes and pre-measured ingredients so you can just cook, eat, and enjoy. All the ingredients come right to your door in recyclable, insulated packaging, pre-measured and handy labeled meal kits, so you know which ingredients go with which recipe. Plus, HelloFresh offers a wide variety of chef-curated recipes that change weekly, whether it's the classic plan with meat, fish, and seasonal produce, the veggie plan, vegetarian recipes with plant-based proteins, or even the family plan, with quick and easy meals the whole family will love. And you can choose the delivery day that works best for you and pause your account for weeks at a time. HelloFresh makes it so easy to cook delicious, balanced dinners for less than $10 a meal. No more time-consuming meal planning or grocery shopping. No spending money on takeout for an easy night, or worrying about gathering ingredients week after week. HelloFresh is absolutely my favorite meal kit delivery service. Last week, I made super soy chicken tenders with jasmine rice and green beans. It was balanced, took less time than takeout, and my 3-year-old loved it. For $30 off your first week of HelloFresh, visit HelloFresh.com and enter the promo code Fictional30. That's FICTIONAL30. All right, now back to the show. The year was 1908, and Inspector LeGrasse was waiting outside the meeting of the American Archaeological Society in St. Louis. He looked down at the statue and shuddered at the memory. He couldn't look at it without seeing them. Honestly, he would never forget that night. Back in those days, there were parts of the swamp where you just didn't go. Because they were dangerous swamps was usually reason enough, but that night, there were rumors. There were sounds of beating drums, chants, and screams on the wind. It was earlier that day that they had learned of several women and children that had been kidnapped from a community squatting somewhere in the swamp. Even in November, the swamp was balmy, yet the grips of their guns weren't wet from the humidity. The road pulled one way, while the screams arrived from the other. Down one way, there were lights. The other, darkness and swampland, and whatever was left of those stolen women and children. LeGrasse had been on enough of these to know how this ended. They had no idea how bad it would be. Soon, the inspector and his men were no longer trudging through overgrown trees and vines, but following a spider's web of paths that all converged onto a single mud road. Ahead, they could see the glow of smoke and fires in the night. The chanting, the drumming, and the screaming grew louder. LeGrasse noted some of his men glancing from side to side at one another, looking for some form of support. They found none. Finally, they approached the tree line, and the group was before them. They were swaying as one, while a man at the front writhed and chanted and danced to the same omnipresent chant pulsing through the air. In his house at Rillier, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Slowly and in horror, LeGrasse registered what he was after. The women and children, or what was left of them, that is. A dark green statuette stood on the monolith, before the leader of it all. On it hung arms and legs and heads of all the innocent women and children who had been kidnapped earlier in the day. The crowd was so enraptured with their ceremony that they didn't hear LeGrasse shouting that they were all under arrest. Seconds later, they did hear his gun as he fired into the air. Most of the crowd got away. There must have been over 100 people there, each familiar enough with the swamps to disappear. Those who stayed swarmed the police, and when everything ended, 5 of them were dead and 47 arrested. Officers spent the rest of the night dragging stragglers from the swamp, feeling the eyes from the hidden, boring through them, watching from the trees, and still hearing those words, the ones from the chant, whispered in darkness. Legrasse grabbed the statue and learned that the creature it depicted had a name. Cthulhu, the high priest, the thing that made men dream. Of the 47 arrested, only 2 were found sane enough to be hanged, and only one of those 2 talked. His name was Old Castro. While the others spat and sneered at the police, Old Castro laughed. He announced that their coming was inevitable. There was no use keeping it secret, and there would be no mistaking it, no stopping it. The old ones would return. To which Legrasse replied, "Okay, I'm going to need a lot of exposition on that." And Old Castro obliged. "The Earth didn't belong to the humans," Old Castro started, "millions upon millions of years ago. Long before humans had spread like a pestilence on the face of the Earth, the planet had belonged to others. They had come from the stars, from somewhere else. It didn't matter where. It only mattered that they were still on the Earth. The great old ones had roamed the Earth, built their massive cities, and conquered the world. While the stars were right, they could move from planet to planet, plane to plane in an instant. When the stars were wrong, they died. Long ago, the stars turned, and the great old ones began to weaken. They turned to their priest, Cthulhu, to preserve them as they slept, to wait for when the stars were right again, for the time when they could awaken." Old Castro's wrinkled lips curled into a smile. That time was coming. The stars were changing once again, and the great old ones would walk the earth once more. Legrasse rolled his eyes. And how does some vagrant living in the swampland of Louisiana know about the behemoths that roam the earth of pre-history? Old Castro didn't register the condescension. He looked up at Legrasse, and his words resounded with a cold, knowing certainty. The cult had been hidden since the dawn of humanity, passed on in hushed words and dreams, given to them by the old ones, buried deep within the earth. There were high priests in every land. Hidden symbols and art and stories from every culture throughout history all spoke of the old ones in one way or another. And now, the timeline was speeding up. People other than the initiated would have dreams, and they would see him, Cthulhu. It had been millions upon millions of years, but the stars would soon be right again. The earth ready. Until then, the old ones could only lie in the dark and think and talk. They couldn't speak to the soft mammal minds that overwhelmed their planet, but there were those among the humans that were more sensitive. Old Castro smiled. He and his ancestors, stretching back into the mists of myth, listened to the old ones. They had shaped Old Castro's dreams and life. Then, Old Castro's words seemed to boom through the police station. Legrasse knew that Old Castro was crazy, but there wasn't a hint of uncertainty in Old Castro's eyes. He knew what he was saying was true. He stood until he looked Legrasse square in the eyes. "They're coming," he said, "and they will be resurrected soon to take back their world, and then it will be consumed in ecstasy and fire. The faithful ones would be rewarded, and the earth would drink deeply of the blood of all the others." Old Castro chuckled and returned to his hunched, easygoing form. When Old Castro was hanged for the role he played in the deaths of all those innocent people, he didn't weep. He didn't beg. He didn't waver. Before the hangman pulled the lever and the floor dropped out from below Old Castro's weathered feet, the man looked Legrasse in the eye again and said, "That is not dead which can eternal lie. And with strange eons, even death may die." Things were quiet after that, though on a chilly autumn night, among the rustling of leaves, Legrasse thought he could still hear shouting and shrieking and chanting somewhere off in the swamp. The statue stuck in his mind. At first he laughed off Old Castro as a crazy old man, but what if it was true? What if humanity wasn't the first? What if we didn't own the Earth, but we were like the vermin that took up residence in an abandoned house? If that was true, if creatures from the unknown, who had existed millions of years before humanity, were returning, he needed to know more. He called some friends, grabbed the statue, and made his way to St. Louis. The society was interested but wary. They had seen many fakes, so they kept LaGrasse's testimony largely off record. At least, that was the official story. The man writing to Professor Angell urged caution. If there was a death cult out there that had somehow managed to stay hidden since the dawn of humanity, then they were not to be underestimated. Angell's friends suspected that that was the reason, even more so than the suspicions of forgery, that the mentions of Cthulhu and sculpture were left out of the minutes. Angell glanced at the representation of the statue that had been drawn. It was the exact same statue that Henry had made from his dreams. Angell's mind reeled. Was it possible? Could it be that humanity was some sort of squatter species, while the Earth waited for its true masters to reawaken? Even worse, how had a cult so widespread and so pervasive persisted since the dawn of humanity without someone knowing about it? Without him knowing about it? This was his expertise. How had it escaped him? He looked at the clock and put away his things. Henry would be by soon, no doubt to tell him about his dreams. Angell shuddered. What if Henry was one of them? A few minutes passed before Angell stole another glance at the clock. Henry was supposed to have been there already. The man was never late. Angell grabbed his coat. 20 minutes later, Professor Angell passed a doctor on the stairs, and there was shouting from behind the door. Henry's parents were inside. Henry had gone mad. There wasn't any explanation for it either. There was no fever, no physical ailment, yet Henry sat up in bed, raving nonsense against his restraints, or what the doctors and his parents took to be nonsense. Professor Angell knew exactly what the ravings meant. He was talking about his dreams. He had woken up screaming that morning, and the doctors were perplexed. There appeared to be no physical cause for his malady, and so they just restrained him so he couldn't hurt himself or others, and left him in the care of his parents. After that day, Angell visited every morning, and nearly a week after his first visit, he was surprised to see Henry sitting up and chatting happily. Even more so, because Henry had no recollection of the past week. To him, he had fallen asleep and woken up, only restrained, and much hungrier than usual. And why did he have a bedpan? Angell explained that he had been raving about his dreams. Henry's smile flatlined as he grew still. His eyes stared off into the distance, but he shook it off moments later, and his smile returned. The dreams won't be a problem anymore, he announced. Angell was confused, but Henry's predictions proved correct. Angell followed up for a week straight at Henry's house, but all of his dreams were normal, not the vivid, terrifying, and repetitive things that had driven him into temporary madness. Or so Henry claimed. And since he no longer had those terrifying dreams, Henry suggested that they stop this whole interview thing. He guessed that the language professor had better things to do than play anachronistic psychotherapist to a struggling artist. That evening, Professor Angell didn't know what led him to look back that last time at Henry's house. He didn't know why he felt such a chill at Henry staring down at him from his window. Henry was his friend, after all, or had been. Angell nodded goodbye, and Henry replied with a faint, forced smile before the curtains fluttered over the window. There was a chill in the air as Professor Angell walked home. It was late autumn in New England, and the old man wrapped his coat tighter around his body and walked faster. His walk brought him down by the docks, and he looked out across the ocean. Any other night, he'd love to watch that last little bit of light shimmer on the water. Tonight, there was a chill that he couldn't shake. The water wasn't beautiful, wasn't poetic. In its depths, it could hold the monstrous gods of old, and they could be returning. The sidewalk was getting tight, he noticed. Weird for an evening like this. It looked like a lot of sailors were returning to port. Angell nodded politely to the sailors, edging past the group and on the side of the sidewalk with the steep embankment going down to the rocks and the sea. He was cold and was gonna bark at the men to give him a little more room when he heard the words. It came from one of the sailors, whispered in his ear as he passed. In his house at Rillier, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Hearing that name sent a chill down his spine, and as he turned and looked at the burly man, the color drained from his face. The man had a look that said he knew Angel's face, and that Professor Angel had been asking the wrong questions to the wrong people for too long. To anyone watching, Angel, the 93-year-old professor, had tried to pass a group of people at a bad time. He seemed cold and impatient. Witnesses would say the group of sailors tried to help him. They even dove into the water. He was just an old man who missed a step and went tumbling down to the embankment. He was knocked unconscious on the rocks and either died from blood loss or drowning in the frigid November waters. On the night that Professor Angel died, sailors looked out into the harbor of Sydney, Australia. It was foggy, so they could only see blurry lights at first. A boat was being pulled ashore after it had been found at sea. Drifting, it only had 2 passengers. A dead man found below deck, a smile frozen on his face, and the captain, a man named Johansson, collapsed at the helm, barely alive, and gripping a small, green-black statuette. The ship was one thought lost months ago. It was called the Alert. That's where we'll leave it for this time. I wanted to do Cthulhu in 1 episode, but the story was just too rich and there's too much going on. So it will go 2 episodes, and season 1 will go 11 episodes. Think of it as a bonus episode for season 1. Next time, we'll finish up the story of the Call of Cthulhu and learn of what happened to Johansson on the island. Now, it's time for the best of the worst. The villain this time is the Armless Tiger Man from the Marvel Universe. Gustav Hertz was a German factory worker in the late 1930s. One afternoon, he laid his hands in the wrong place, only for an instant, but it was enough for him to be pulled into the machine up to his shoulders. Pressing back on the machine with his legs and yelling for his coworkers, they were able to stop the machine before it went full monkey's paw on him. Unfortunately, the damage to his arms was catastrophic, and he was a double amputee. Sitting in his apartment, Hertz looked on the book the doctor had just given him, likely called Supervillainy in You, Making the Worst of Your Tragic Backstory. In it described a way for Hertz to use his teeth, legs, and feet in place of arms. He read the book and then drastically overdid it. He became so dexterous with his feet that he was able to throw knives with them and hit a bullseye from a room away. His jaw became so strong that he could use it to dive off ledges and swing on chains, and his leg muscles became so overdeveloped that he could kick apart machines. And that's exactly what he did. He donned a trench coat and went to dish out some justice on the factories of the Nazi war machine. But not the type of justice you'd think. His problem wasn't with the Nazi party. He was actually really into that. His problem was with machines. Machines that caused his current state, and machines would pay. Oh, and also Hertz made the very logical leap that he was now the Armless Tiger Man. He carefully sharpened his teeth and decided to partake in some cannibalism while he was at it. When he was arrested by the SS, they learned that 1, this guy wasn't a spy or saboteur, and 2, this guy's worldview was a little extreme. Yeah, the Nazis found him to be too extreme. So they floated an idea. How about Gustav takes a boat to the US, who still hadn't entered the war yet, and dive into a full all-you-can-sabotage buffet of factories before the Americans stop him and solve this crazy little problem. Hertz agreed. And he was immediately discovered and arrested because he's a guy who thinks he's an armless tiger with a fairly pronounced German accent kicking apart factories. He ended up escaping and went back to work for the Nazis in Wakanda, the home of the Black Panther, where his teeth were strong enough to swing on chains and tear apart factories, but not strong enough to stop a bullet from a howling commando. That's it for this time. Thank you so much for listening. Today's episode was written by me, Jason Weiser, and produced by Carissa Weiser. And our theme song is by the amazing Breakmaster Cylinder. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.